The past in the rearview. Raymond Watson stood with his hands cuffed behind his back, the metal biting into his wrists. He could feel the sweat running down his brow, mixing with the dust of the dirt road beneath his boots. The officer, a young man with too much authority for his own good, was standing a few feet away, rummaging through Raymond's truck as though he were searching for some sort of contraband. The patrol car's lights blinked relentlessly, painting the scene in an almost surreal flash of red and blue, amplifying the absurdity of it all. In a way, Raymond couldn't help but smile at the irony. Here he was, a man who had commanded a fleet, who had steered ships through storms and fought in the most dangerous corners of the world, being treated like some common criminal on the side of a dusty, forgotten road. He thought about the long years of training, the struggles and sacrifices, the respect he had earned over decades in the Navy. And yet, now, this officer, likely a decade younger than him, seemed to think he was just some man in a rundown truck. The officer muttered under his breath as he dug through Raymond's vehicle, papers, a set of tools, a worn leather jacket thrown across the passenger seat. Raymond didn't need to look to know what he'd find. Nothing of consequence. Just the remnants of an old life. A life Raymond had carefully built and was proud of. But here, under the sweltering sun, it meant nothing. For a brief moment, Raymond closed his eyes, letting the heat wash over him. This was the price of aging, of living in a world that often seemed to forget the value of experience. So much had changed since he'd left the Navy. Some things had moved forward, and others, like this very moment, seemed to regress into ignorance and injustice. But Raymond wasn't a man who easily bent under pressure. He had learned long ago that life wasn't about avoiding conflict, it was about standing tall, no matter the circumstance. Even if it meant being treated like dirt on the side of a road. The officer, oblivious to the quiet strength radiating from Raymond, finally finished his search. He walked back to Raymond with a smug look on his face, a sense of false triumph clinging to him as though he had just uncovered some deep, hidden conspiracy. "You know," the officer said, adjusting his sunglasses as he stood in front of Raymond. "It's a shame. You don't look like much, but you've got the demeanor of someone who thinks they're above the law." Raymond met the officer's gaze without flinching. "You don't know me," he said, his voice low but firm. The officer chuckled, a small, arrogant sound. "Oh, I think I do. You're the type that thinks they can just coast through life, no consequences. But let me tell you something, you don't get to play by different rules. Not out here. Not in this part of the world." Raymond didn't respond right away. Instead, he focused on the officer's words. He could feel the officer's need to assert dominance, to make himself feel important by putting down someone who seemed weaker or more vulnerable. It was a game, and Raymond could see through it. For a moment, the officer seemed to wait for a reaction, a plea for mercy, perhaps, or even a surrender. But Raymond didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, he stood still, his back straight, his posture as unyielding as the mountains he had sailed across in his youth. "I'm not the one breaking the law," Raymond said finally. His voice had taken on a calm but insistent tone. "And if you know who I am, you wouldn't be standing here treating me like this." The officer paused, his expression flickering for a moment, confusion flashing across his face. "And who are you supposed to be? Some old vet with delusions of grandeur? Some has-been with a bunch of stories?" Raymond's eyes, sharp as ever, locked onto the officer's. "I am Raymond Watson. Former United States Navy Admiral. And if you think you can treat me like some criminal without consequences, you've made a serious mistake." The officer's face twisted for a moment, trying to process the words. Raymond could see the disbelief creeping into the officer's eyes. The world they inhabited was one where labels were often more important than truth. A man like Raymond, a black man in a rusty old truck on a desolate road, didn't match the stereotype the officer had in mind. The officer cleared his throat, the cockiness in his posture faltering just a little. Right, he said, his voice laced with doubt. I've heard that story before. But this? This doesn't look like the life of an admiral. Raymond stood his ground, the weight of his words sinking in. His posture had not wavered. The years he had spent leading, commanding, making split-second decisions, preparing for battle, all of it had brought him to this moment. He had always known that the world could be cruel, could misjudge you at the drop of a hat, but that didn't mean he was going to bend or break. The officer was still fidgeting with his radio, trying to get some sort of confirmation, maybe even trying to dismiss Raymond's claim. Raymond, however, could see the officer's uncertainty. His hands were shaking just a little, his confidence slipping as the reality of the situation dawned on him. In the face of uncertainty, people like this officer often resorted to pushing harder, acting out of fear instead of authority. "You want to play games with me?" the officer muttered under his breath, glancing back at Raymond as if to challenge him. "No," Raymond replied. "I just want you to understand the gravity of what you're doing." The officer stepped forward, clearly agitated, and Raymond could see his posture become more confrontational, the kind of energy that came from someone too proud to back down. "I don't care who you are. You're getting in the back of my car, and you're going to stay there until we figure out what's going on." Raymond took a step forward, his voice low but commanding. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone now firm with a quiet authority that seemed to hang in the air. "I've been through far worse than this, and I'm not the one you need to worry about." But the officer, fueled by whatever insecurities or biases were driving him, wasn't about to back down. He walked over and roughly grabbed Raymond's arm, pulling him toward the back of the patrol car. The officer's grip was tight, but Raymond felt no fear. Instead, he felt the pressure of the moment building, the weight of his words and his experience now hanging in the balance. The moment was teetering on the edge of something far bigger than this one officer could ever comprehend. Raymond knew it. And deep down, the officer probably did too. As they approached the patrol car, the sound of approaching sirens from the distance suddenly broke the tension, but it was too late. The officer had already made his decision. And Raymond, though outnumbered, was about to make sure that decision would cost him far more than he ever imagined. The twist. The sun's harsh rays beat down on Raymond's head as the officer's hand clamped down on his arm, forcing him toward the patrol car. Despite the heat, Raymond's heart remained steady, his breath even and measured. He had been through far worse than this, though it felt almost laughable that an officer of the law would dare to challenge him. The officer's grip tightened as if trying to force Raymond into submission, but Raymond's posture remained unwavering, a silent resistance. The officer's radio crackled to life, a sharp, static-filled voice barely cutting through the tension. "Dispatch, do you copy?" the voice barked. The officer, still holding Raymond's arm with an iron grip, didn't even flinch. "Copy that. Just a routine stop. A little troublemaker. I'm taking him in." Raymond could hear the voice on the other end, faintly, asking for more details. But the officer, eager to keep control of the situation, cut off the transmission before his superior had a chance to ask too many questions. "Everything's under control," he muttered into the radio. "I'll handle it from here." Raymond glanced back at the patrol car, the bright red and blue lights flashing like some kind of twisted circus. The young officer was so caught up in his own sense of power that he didn't realize he was already making a critical mistake. Raymond knew this man, he could almost feel his inexperience radiating off him. This wasn't a fight Raymond wanted, but it was one he was ready to face if he had to. "Come on, old man," the officer sneered, yanking him roughly toward the car. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Raymond's feet met the gravel with each step, the harsh scrape of the ground beneath him a sharp reminder of how vulnerable this moment felt. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with, no idea who Raymond Watson really was. The cap on the passenger seat, the worn-out truck, the humble lunch, it all spoke of a man who had long since hung up his glory days. But the officer couldn't have been more wrong. Raymond wasn't just an old man in a truck. He was a man who had fought for his country, who had led men into battle, and who understood the true meaning of sacrifice. When the officer shoved him into the back of the patrol car, Raymond took a deep breath, his muscles tightening with the tension of the moment. The cramped space in the car seemed small, almost oppressive, but it couldn't contain the fire that simmered within him. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone, but in this moment, he knew what had to be done. "Think you can get away with this, old man?" The officer's words came through the open window, a mocking smirk on his face. But before Raymond could respond, the officer turned back to his patrol car and, still with a trace of arrogance, slammed the door shut. The minute the officer's back was turned, Raymond let out a quiet sigh, his muscles still tense but his mind focused. He'd been in sticky situations before, but this one was different. This wasn't about combat strategy or enemy forces. This was about a man who felt the need to prove himself by making someone else small. And Raymond was far from small. The officer got back in his car, the engine rumbling to life as the sound of the radio crackled again. There was an exchange of words on the other end, likely a request for more details, but it was clear the officer was trying to avoid it. The urgency in his voice betrayed his lack of confidence. Raymond could feel it. The officer was scrambling, his mind racing with the possibilities of how this could turn out. What had started as a simple stop now felt like a powder keg, and Raymond was no longer just a passive figure waiting for things to happen. In that moment, he shifted. The calm, steady rhythm of his breath deepened, and the years of discipline and training in the Navy kicked in. He was no longer just a man caught in a moment of misunderstanding. He was a man who knew exactly how to handle pressure. He was a man who could outthink anyone who tried to control him. Outside the patrol car, the officer's smirk was slowly fading, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Raymond could see it in his posture, in the way he held himself now, like a dog that had finally realized it wasn't the only predator in the field. He had made a grave mistake, and now he had no idea what he was dealing with. Raymond's mind was already several steps ahead. He knew that once he got out of this situation, things would unfold in ways that the officer wouldn't be able to control. He could feel the weight of his reputation bearing down on him, the title of admiral that once meant something, the years of service that couldn't just be erased by a young officer's arrogance. But Raymond also knew that in a world that had forgotten the respect that men like him deserved, he would have to fight a different kind of battle now. Not one of war, but one of perception, of power, and of the way the world viewed him. The sound of the officer's boots crunching against the gravel reached Raymond's ears as he sat still in the back seat. A bead of sweat dripped down his face, but he didn't move. The heat in the car was suffocating, but he didn't care. He was about to turn the tables. The officer's shadow loomed outside the window, his figure filling the frame with a sense of self-satisfaction. He thought this was over. He thought Raymond Watson was just an old man who could be treated however the officer saw fit. But Raymond knew better. And soon, the officer would understand that. The young cop swung open the door with force, the vehicle shaking slightly. He reached inside with a practiced motion, preparing to pull Raymond out by the cuffs and continue the charade. But before he could take another step, Raymond's voice broke through the air, cold and calculated. "You really don't want to do that, son," Raymond said, his voice carrying a weight far beyond the officer's expectations. The officer hesitated for the briefest moment, and in that instant, Raymond's fingers were at work. A subtle shift, a quiet movement, and suddenly the officer's own weapon was in Raymond's hands. He had done this hundreds of times before, disarming, redirecting, controlling the environment. The officer's eyes widened in shock as he stumbled backward, his hands raised in sudden panic. But Raymond didn't move to harm him. Instead, he held the officer's weapon firmly in his grip, a symbol of the power he once wielded with ease, and a reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous men were those who had the most to lose. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Raymond said, his voice low and full of authority. The officer's breath quickened, the shock and disbelief creeping into his features. He was suddenly very aware that he had underestimated this old man, a man whose calm demeanor now stood as a stark contrast to the blundering chaos he had brought upon himself. But Raymond didn't need to raise his voice any higher. He had already won. The officer's arrogance had collapsed, and Raymond's calculated actions had proven the point. In that instant, everything had changed. And the world, for better or worse, would soon know exactly who Raymond Watson was. The reckoning. The officer stood frozen in place, his wide eyes locked on Raymond as the older man gripped his own gun with a steady hand. The officer had always been in control, always the one holding the power, the badge, the authority. But now, for the first time in his life, he was at the mercy of someone far older, far wiser, and far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Raymond Watson was no longer just a retired Navy Admiral. He was a force to be reckoned with. Raymond held the officer's weapon with precision, his fingers wrapped around the handle in a way that suggested familiarity, comfort, even, as if he had been here before. And in truth, he had. The years of training, the countless operations he had led, the countless enemies he had faced, all seemed to come rushing back in this single, tense moment. There was no fear in Raymond, no hesitation, just a calm, calculated response to a world that had begun to forget the value of respect. He had spent decades in service to his country, and yet here he was, treated as if he were nothing more than an old man with a rusted truck. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Raymond said again, his voice firm but low, as if he were speaking to a child who hadn't yet learned the rules of the world. He could see the officer's hands trembling, but Raymond didn't feel any satisfaction from the fear. Instead, his gaze remained unwavering, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. For a long moment, there was only silence. The officer stood frozen, not daring to make a move, the shock on his face slowly turning into something else, uncertainty, maybe even a flicker of fear. He had expected to have the upper hand, to be the one in control. But now, he was the one at the mercy of a man whose life had been defined by discipline, strategy, and leadership. A man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had lived to tell the tale. Raymond didn't raise the weapon or move toward the officer. He didn't need to. The mere presence of it, the quiet authority in his voice, was enough to shift the balance of power. The officer could feel it, feel the weight of his own arrogance crashing down on him as his hands slowly dropped to his sides, the gun in Raymond's hands now a clear reminder that this wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. This was something far more profound, far more dangerous. After a few seconds of tense silence, the officer finally took a small step backward, as though to distance himself from the situation. Raymond's gaze followed him, calculating every movement. He knew the officer wasn't going to attack. He had already lost the moment he had underestimated Raymond. You don't have to do this," the officer stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. His voice cracked, betraying his panic. Raymond's eyes never left him. "I don't have to do anything," he replied coolly. "But you've already done it. You've crossed a line." The officer, his face now flushed with a mixture of fear and confusion, looked around as though he were searching for an escape, an ally, perhaps, or another officer who could come to his aid. But there was no one. Just the open road, the desolate landscape, and the unmistakable presence of the man in front of him. Raymond let the silence hang in the air, letting the officer stew in his own uncertainty. He wasn't going to make a move just yet. He didn't need to. The officer had already made the first misstep. Now it was just a matter of letting him realize the full extent of his error. "I don't want to hurt you," Raymond said softly, though his voice carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "But you need to understand that some things are unforgivable." The officer swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the side as if looking for a way out, a reason to act like this had all been a mistake. He was realizing too late that he had underestimated the man in front of him. Raymond had been through battles, physical, mental, emotional, that this officer could never begin to comprehend. He had faced enemies far worse than anything this officer could ever throw at him. And he had always emerged victorious. But Raymond wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't interested in punishment. What he wanted, what he needed, was something far more important than that. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Raymond continued, his voice gentler now, though still full of authority. "But you do have to respect me." The officer opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. The reality of the situation was sinking in now. Raymond wasn't just a man on the side of the road. He wasn't just a retiree, a black man in a run-down truck. He was Raymond Watson, a leader, a strategist, a symbol of everything that the officer had never been able to understand. And that was the twist. That was the reckoning. The officer had thought he was in control. He had thought he could bully and belittle a man who, on the surface, seemed to be just another old man on the edge of society. But Raymond Watson had lived a life of unimaginable depth, a life that the officer would never fully understand. And in this moment, Raymond had the power to strip that arrogance away, to expose it for the fragility that it was. "I didn't choose this," Raymond said, his voice quiet now, almost to himself. "But you forced my hand. And I'm not one to back down." The officer opened his mouth again, but this time his voice cracked, a faint tremor running through him. I don't understand." Raymond took a slow, deliberate step toward him, the officer instinctively stepping back, his eyes wide. "That's the problem," Raymond said, his gaze sharp. "You don't understand. You've never had to understand. But now, you will." The officer's mind raced, trying to find an escape, a way to regain the upper hand, but it was too late. The power had shifted, and now, for the first time, the officer was aware of just how deeply he had miscalculated. "You're nothing," Raymond said quietly, the words not meant to hurt, but to enlighten. "Just a cog in a machine that doesn't see the bigger picture. You think this badge makes you something special, but it doesn't. Not in my world." The officer's shoulders slumped as the realization hit him. He wasn't just being told off by an old man. He was being judged by a man who had once commanded fleets, who had held the lives of others in his hands, who had led with strength and wisdom. This was a man who had seen the world in all its darkness and light and had emerged unbroken. Raymond didn't take his eyes off the officer. He didn't need to. The message had been sent, loud and clear. "What's your name, officer?" Raymond asked suddenly. The officer, still processing everything, stammered, "D. Daniel. Officer Daniel." "Well, Officer Daniel," Raymond said, his voice now softer, almost conversational. "You've just made one of the biggest mistakes of your life. And in a few minutes, the world's going to know exactly what you did. You're going to learn what it means to mess with the wrong man." Raymond stepped back, allowing the officer a moment to collect himself. There was no anger in Raymond's stance now, only a quiet, implacable calm. Officer Daniel was no longer just a man in uniform. He was a symbol of everything Raymond had fought against in his life, a representation of arrogance and a world that often forgot the value of honor. But as Raymond stood there, his grip still steady on the officer's weapon, he knew that soon, the world would remember. The reckoning had begun, and it would echo far beyond this desolate road the fall. The air seemed to thicken with every passing second, the heat of the sun now feeling like it was pressing down on Raymond's shoulders, as though the world itself was watching. Officer Daniel's posture had shifted, no longer brimming with arrogance but with something much darker, fear. His eyes flicked to the road, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in power. The officer's hand twitched, as if he were still considering whether to reach for his own gun or attempt to use the radio, but Raymond could see the uncertainty in his every move. There would be no escape for him now. Raymond stood tall, his feet firmly planted in the dust of the road, his eyes never leaving the young officer. He had always been a man who could read people, a skill he had honed over years of leading men into battle, negotiating intense situations, and making life-or-death decisions. Officer Daniel wasn't a soldier, a strategist, or someone who understood the consequences of his actions. He was just a man, young and untested, caught in a storm of his own making. But the storm was about to break. "I don't want trouble," Officer Daniel muttered under his breath, as if he were trying to convince himself that everything could be set right. But Raymond knew better. The moment the officer had treated him like an insignificant man in a dilapidated truck, he had sealed his fate. The air felt electric now, charged with the weight of something much bigger than a traffic stop. "You've already caused trouble, son," Raymond replied, his voice calm but laden with authority. His words didn't need to be loud, didn't need to be filled with anger. They just needed to be understood. "You've made a mistake, and now you'll have to live with it. But you won't be the one who pays the price. Not alone." The officer's mouth opened, as though he wanted to protest, but no words came. He looked down at the ground, the reality of the situation finally beginning to settle in. His eyes darted toward the patrol car, as though hoping reinforcements would arrive, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch of road and the sun beating down relentlessly. Raymond had watched men break before. He had seen soldiers crumble under pressure, their resolve shattering when faced with the enormity of the battle ahead. Officer Daniel wasn't much different. He had been thrust into a situation that was far beyond his understanding, and now he was scrambling to regain control. But Raymond wasn't about to let him. Not after everything he had endured. Not after the years of sacrifice, the battles fought, the lives lost, and the strength it had taken to rebuild after each blow. No, this wasn't just about an officer and a man in a truck. This was about power. It was about respect. And Raymond Watson wasn't going to let that power be taken from him, especially not by someone who had no idea what it truly meant to earn it. "You've underestimated me," Raymond continued, his tone quieter now, but no less firm. "You don't know who I am, what I've done. But you will. You'll learn just how dangerous it is to treat someone like me like I'm nothing." The officer's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his face a mixture of frustration and fear. His hand reached for his radio, hesitated, and then pulled back. He was torn, unsure of what to do. The moment he had chosen to escalate this situation had turned into something far beyond his control, and now, he could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. I didn't mean," the officer began, but his words faltered, as though he were searching for an excuse, a justification. But there was no excuse. He had made a choice. And now, Raymond was going to make sure that the consequences of that choice were understood. Raymond didn't move, but his eyes narrowed, his voice steady and unyielding. "It's too late for apologies." The silence between them stretched out, thick with tension. The officer's shoulders sagged slightly, as though he were finally beginning to accept the inevitability of the situation. He had been out of his depth from the start, and now, the reality of that was sinking in. Officer Daniel had spent his career wielding the badge like a weapon, treating people as if their lives were worth less than the authority he carried. But now, Raymond Watson was showing him the price of disrespect. Raymond had seen power in all its forms. In the Navy, he had commanded entire fleets, made decisions that affected the lives of thousands. He had been a leader, a man others looked to for guidance, and in that capacity, he had earned his respect. But here, in the dusty stillness of the road, it wasn't about rank or title. It was about the principle of it all. The officer had made the mistake of thinking that power could be taken without consequence. And Raymond wasn't about to let him forget that. "Do you think you're the only one who can control things?" Raymond asked, his voice quiet but cutting through the silence. "You think your uniform gives you the right to treat anyone like this? Like they don't matter?" The officer's hands trembled as they hovered near his gun belt, but he made no move to unholster his weapon. Raymond could see the internal struggle, the conflict playing out in the officer's eyes. He wanted to assert control, wanted to remind Raymond who was in charge, but deep down, he knew better. He was outmatched. This wasn't just a confrontation between a man and a badge, it was a clash of two worlds, two men who understood power in entirely different ways. Raymond stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, never taking his eyes off the officer. He knew that the moment he closed the distance, everything would change. The officer's body language spoke volumes. He was retreating, even as his mind tried to formulate a plan. But there was nothing left to do but face the truth of the situation. "You're scared," Raymond said softly, almost as if to himself. "And you should be." Officer Daniel looked up at Raymond, his expression a mix of confusion and fear, but beneath it, there was something else, realization. The reality of his own vulnerability had finally hit him. Raymond's presence was undeniable now, and for the first time in his life, the officer knew what it felt like to be truly powerless. Raymond took another step closer, and this time, the officer didn't retreat. He stood his ground, but his shoulders slumped in defeat. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," the officer said in a weak attempt at regaining some of his authority. But Raymond could see through the words. The officer wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't even asking for understanding. He was trying to make sense of his own weakness. "Trouble's been caused," Raymond said, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. "Now, we both have to deal with it." The tension in the air was palpable now, each word carrying the weight of the moment. For the officer, it was the beginning of a fall from grace, an awakening to the truth of his own limitations. For Raymond, it was the end of a long road that had led him here, to this single, defining moment. The officer turned his head, staring at the patrol car as if it could offer him an escape. But it was too late. Raymond had made sure of that. Officer Daniel had crossed a line, and now, he would face the consequences of his actions. "What happens now?" the officer asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if he already knew the answer. Raymond's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He had no desire to see this young officer's life ruined. But the officer needed to understand that respect wasn't given, it was earned. And in that moment, Raymond had done what he had to do. "The world will know who you are now," Raymond said quietly. "And so will you." The sound of distant sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of other officers, but Raymond remained unfazed. This moment, this reckoning, had already unfolded, and no one could undo it now, the aftermath. The sound of approaching sirens was no longer a distant threat, it was an unavoidable reality. Raymond could hear the wail of the emergency vehicles getting closer, the tension in the air now thickening as the scene was about to escalate. Officer Daniel's wide eyes flicked to the horizon, but there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The world was moving toward them, and nothing could stop the chain of events that had already been set in motion. Raymond stood still, his posture unyielding, his hand still wrapped around the officer's weapon with calm authority. The officer, still frozen in place, had no idea what to do. His initial arrogance had crumbled, replaced by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had thought that he could control the situation, that a simple traffic stop would be a routine exercise of power, but Raymond Watson had shown him just how much he had underestimated the man standing in front of him. "Please," Officer Daniel said in a broken voice, his earlier bravado completely gone. "You don't have to do this. Just, let me go. I'll call it in. We can forget this ever happened." Raymond's gaze never wavered. He had heard this plea before, sacrifices made in the heat of the moment, people begging for a way out. But Raymond knew better than to offer mercy where it wasn't earned. He had fought too many battles, survived too many moments like this to show compassion to someone who had just attempted to destroy his dignity. This wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. It was about making sure the officer understood the gravity of his mistake. No, Raymond said quietly. You've crossed a line, son. There's no forgetting this. The officer swallowed hard, his eyes searching the open road as though he could will help to arrive faster. But there was no cavalry coming. This was between him and Raymond, and the weight of it was suffocating. As the sirens grew louder, the officer began to visibly shake, his hands twitching as though he were struggling to keep his composure. He had been a man of authority, but now, in front of Raymond, he was just a frightened young officer who had pushed his luck too far. Raymond slowly took a step back, releasing his grip on the weapon, but not out of kindness. It was a calculated movement, one that allowed the officer to breathe but also made it clear that he was still in control of the situation. The officer's shoulders slumped in defeat, his entire body language speaking volumes about the shift in power. The fear had replaced the bravado, and with it came the realization that this was the moment where everything changed. As the sirens finally reached their crescendo, two police cruisers pulled up behind the patrol car, the officers within eyeing the scene with suspicion. Raymond could feel the shift in the air. These new arrivals would have questions, but their presence wasn't enough to change the situation. They weren't the ones who had made the decision to escalate this. That was Officer Daniel's mistake, and now it was time for the world to see it. The first officer, a tall man with graying hair, stepped out of his car and eyed the scene. He looked over at Raymond and then at Officer Daniel, who had already been separated from his radio, hands clasped in front of him in a futile attempt to regain his composure. "Everything all right here?" the new officer asked, his voice cautious but not yet aggressive. Raymond's eyes flicked to him, and he shook his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice still calm but filled with an unspoken weight. "But it will be. Soon enough." The officer nodded slowly, clearly unsure of how to approach the situation. He glanced back at Daniel, who was standing with his hands now resting on the roof of his patrol car, staring at the ground. There was no defiance left in him, just the hollow acceptance of his failure. The senior officer glanced back at Raymond, and then at the gun that was still held loosely in his hand. "I'm going to need you to step back for a moment," the senior officer said, his tone shifting slightly toward authority. Raymond didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle. "I'm fine where I am. But if you're looking for the truth, you should probably ask him," Raymond said, jerking his head slightly toward Officer Daniel. The senior officer turned his attention fully to Daniel now. The younger man was standing silently, his face pale as he slowly raised his head to meet the officer's gaze. His lips parted to speak, but no words came. Raymond could see that Daniel knew he had no way out. He had already made the call, and now, the consequences were unfolding around him. "What's going on here?" the senior officer demanded, his voice sharp. For a moment, Daniel just stood there, his mind struggling to process the enormity of the situation. The officer hesitated, as though the words might betray him, as though admitting to the error would somehow add to his shame. But then, finally, his shoulders drooped further, and he spoke in a voice so quiet that it was almost drowned out by the whirring of the sirens in the background. I messed up," Officer Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "I pulled over the wrong guy. And I tried to control a situation that wasn't mine to control." Raymond watched silently as the words left Daniel's mouth, the officer's admission hanging in the air like a bitter confession. The senior officer was silent for a moment, his gaze flickering between Raymond and the younger man. The air felt thick, like the weight of the world had settled on their shoulders, and every second that passed only added to the tension. "You pulled over a retired Navy Admiral, Daniel," the senior officer said, his tone grave. "And you treated him like a criminal. Do you understand what you've done?" Daniel nodded weakly, his face flushing with shame. "Yes, sir. I didn't know. I didn't realize who he was. I just saw an old man in a junky truck." Raymond's eyes remained fixed on Officer Daniel, and he felt no satisfaction in the officer's misery. He had seen enough men break, had witnessed the cost of arrogance far too many times. But this moment wasn't about the officer's ruin, it was about making sure the world understood that no one was above the law, no one was above respect. "Good," the senior officer said, his voice clipped. "Then you'll need to come with us. You're going to explain yourself to Internal Affairs. And I'm sure there will be plenty of questions to answer back at the station." Raymond stood silently as the officers escorted Daniel to their patrol car. He felt no anger, no desire to see the officer suffer. What Raymond wanted was simple: accountability. The officer had misjudged him. And now, the officer would face the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just about one man's humiliation, it was about a larger lesson. As the senior officer turned to Raymond, he offered a quick nod. "Thank you for your patience, sir. We'll handle this from here." Raymond gave a single nod in return, his expression unreadable. The truth was, he didn't need gratitude. He didn't need anything. All he needed was to know that in the end, respect would be restored. The world would remember who Raymond Watson was. And Officer Daniel, for all his mistakes, would learn that sometimes, the greatest battles weren't fought with weapons or force. They were fought with honor, dignity, and the quiet strength of a man who had earned his place in this world. As the patrol cars pulled away, Raymond watched them go, standing alone in the middle of the road. The silence of the moment was deafening, but for Raymond, it was a quiet victory.